Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a side of World War I you probably didn't learn about in school. We all know about the trenches, the new technologies of war, and the tragic human cost. But behind the battlefields, another war was being waged, a war of money, debt, and economic survival. This was the hidden financial battle that arguably determined the victor as much as any general on the front lines. So, how do you pay for a war that's bigger, deadlier, and more expensive than any conflict in human history? That was the billion-dollar question facing every nation in 1914. At the start, most leaders believed the war would be over by Christmas. They thought they could fund it with their existing gold reserves and maybe some short-term loans. But as the conflict dragged on, turning into a brutal war of attrition, this optimistic view shattered. Gold reserves dwindled, and the cost skyrocketed. We're talking about figures that are staggering even by today's standards. For Britain alone, the war cost roughly £34 billion in the currency of the day. Germany spent even more. This wasn't just a military crisis, it was an economic catastrophe in the making. The first and most direct way to get money was, of course, taxes. Governments on both sides hiked income taxes, introduced new excess profit taxes on companies doing well from the war, and levied taxes on everyday goods like tea, tobacco, and alcohol. But there's a limit to how much you can tax your citizens, especially when you need them to stay motivated for the war effort. Taxing people into poverty isn't exactly a recipe for high morale. So, while taxes helped, they were just a drop in the ocean. The real money had to come from somewhere else. This is where war bonds come into the picture. You've probably seen the iconic posters. Your country needs you to buy war bonds. This was a stroke of genius, both financially and psychologically. Essentially, the government was borrowing money directly from its own people. Citizens would buy a bond, which was a loan to the government, with the promise that they would be paid back with interest after the war was won. It was framed as a patriotic duty. Every bond purchased was a bullet fired at the enemy. This massive public fundraising effort was incredibly successful. It not only raised enormous sums of cash, but also made millions of ordinary people feel personally invested in the outcome of the war. They weren't just bystanders, they were stakeholders in victory. But even the patriotism of their own citizens wasn't enough. The Allies, particularly Britain and France, quickly realized they needed more cash than they could ever raise at home. And there was one country that was sitting on a mountain of it: the United States. In the early years of the war, America was officially neutral, but it was also the world's rising industrial and financial power. Wall Street, and specifically the banking house of J.P. Morgan and Co., became the unofficial banker to the Allies. The Morgan Bank arranged colossal loans for Britain and France, allowing them to buy American steel, food, cotton, and munitions. This wasn't just a simple transaction. It was a lifeline. Without these American loans and supplies, the Allied war effort likely would have collapsed by 1916. This created a fascinating dynamic. America was officially neutral, but its economy became deeply intertwined with an Allied victory. If the Allies lost, they would default on those massive loans, which could trigger a financial crisis in the United States. This economic tie is one of the often overlooked factors that nudged America closer and closer to joining the war on the Allied side. Meanwhile, what about the Central Powers? Germany had a different problem. Its main strategy relied on a quick, decisive victory. They planned to win the war fast and then force the defeated nations to pay for the entire thing through massive reparations. Because of this winner-take-all gamble, they didn't focus as much on securing long-term foreign credit. Furthermore, a highly effective British naval blockade cut Germany off from global trade and international financial markets. They couldn't borrow from America the way the Allies could. So, Germany had to turn inward. They issued war bonds, just like the Allies, but they also took a far riskier path. They started printing money. Lots of it. This is a classic economic trap. When you print vast amounts of currency that isn't backed by any real economic value, you get inflation. The German mark began to lose its value. Prices for food and basic goods started to climb. While this wasn't a huge problem during the war itself, because the government could enforce price controls, they were setting the stage for the catastrophic hyperinflation that would cripple Germany in the early 1920s. The financial decisions made during the war had devastating consequences that would last for a generation and contribute to the political instability that followed. As the war reached its final stages, the economic differences were stark. The Allies, fueled by the seemingly bottomless pit of American credit and industry, could sustain the fight. The Central Powers were being starved, not just of food and supplies due to the blockade, but of the financial resources needed to continue. Germany's allies, like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were economically shattered. Their internal economies collapsed. The German home front was also breaking down, with widespread shortages and growing unrest. The war ended not just because of defeats on the battlefield, but because the Central Powers were financially and economically exhausted. They simply couldn't afford to fight anymore. The aftermath was a world drowning in debt. The victors, Britain and France, owed immense sums to the United States. To pay off those debts, they insisted on crippling reparations from Germany, as laid out in the Treaty of Versailles. This created a toxic cycle. Germany was forced to pay the Allies, who then used that money to pay back the United States. This financial entanglement poisoned international relations for years. The German economy, already weakened by the war and printing money, was completely crushed by these reparations, leading to the infamous hyperinflation crisis where people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. So, when we look back at World War I, it's crucial to see beyond the trenches. The war was fought and won in banks, on stock exchanges, and on production lines, just as much as it was in the fields of Flanders. The ability to raise money, secure loans, and maintain economic stability was a weapon as powerful as any artillery piece. The financial battle behind the Great War didn't just decide the winner. It reshaped the global economic order, marking the decline of Britain as the world's financial center and the undeniable rise of the United States. It also left a legacy of debt, resentment, and economic instability that directly contributed to the crises of the 1920s and 30s, and ultimately the outbreak of another world war. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the economics of World War I. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see covered. Until next time, stay curious